Hello, this is Chloe Carr, and this is my presentation on the history of Native American education. Um, Pre-colonial education. Before Europeans arrived, Native Americans occupied the land for tens of thousands of years. There were thousands of tribes. Each tribe had their own culture, their own values and languages, so you have to kind of speak broadly when talking about them as a group, but their education was completely holistic. Spirituality, community roles, and history were taught through oral tradition and active participation. Education overall was focused on living well within nature and community. In 1819, the fifth U.S. President, James Monroe, passed the Indian Civilization Fund. The point of this bill was to assimilate Native Americans into white American culture. The goal was to eradicate Native American culture and language, and it laid the groundwork for Native American boarding schools. Native American boarding schools began operation in 1819. The first off-reservation boarding school was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. This school would forcibly assimilate over 7,800 Native American children. And it became a model for more than 500 Native American boarding schools that would come after it. Because the schools were now off the reservation, children would be taken from their homes and family, be taken from their culture, and forced to attend these schools. Inside the schools, abuse of every kind ran rampant, and more than 3,000 children died. So here you can kind of see the kind of forced assimilation into Christianity on the left. You can see kind of what the living quarters were like. We've got 3 kids in a bed, all kinds of beds in one room, like not a good situation. So that went on and continued to go on after this, but in 1928, the Merriam Report came out. The Institute for Government Research commissioned Lewis Merriam to survey and compile information about conditions of Native Americans across the country. The report found that federal policy resulted in extreme poverty, poor health, and malnutrition among Native Americans. It then raised national awareness of the horrible conditions that were in Native boarding schools. Then finally, in 1975, Gerald Ford signed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. This act gave tribes the authority to directly operate their own schools. This was the first time that Native Americans were allowed to teach their own culture and knowledge, traditions, and language in their schools. And then on the right, I just have a protest. This was the Trail of Self-Determination protests. It's cross-country protests, and it just goes to show the difficulty that Native Americans were experiencing actually implementing this act. I have a couple data points here for you to look at. The first one is looking at chronic absenteeism. You can see Native Americans are in the green, and in the red we have the average for all students. So extremely high chronic absenteeism. I think that shows a continued mistrust in the education system. And then on the right, this data is just showing really a lack of funding. This is percent of students attending high school that offer AP classes. On the right, only 76% of Native American students are attending high schools that offer AP classes. So if I could suggest a law to be enacted today, I called it the Healing Through Education Act. The biggest thing for this act would be guaranteed funding for Native-led schools for Native students. This would be funding that wouldn't be subject to budget cuts. It would be guaranteed. And per student, the funding would be required to match or exceed the funding of the country's highest funded districts. This funding would go to everything. It would go into transportation, infrastructure. Another part of the act would be that schools would hire Native teachers. These are teachers that would not be required to have any state or federal official certification. These are elders of their own culture that can come in and reintegrate their knowledge of their language, their history, their culture. And then I kind of have the 4 seasons represented here. This act would allow for a flexible school year and outdoor activities so that Native students can participate in seasonal and nature-based learning. Thank you.